Gary Barlow too. It's 20 minutes past 2. Let's talk to Professor Richard Dawkins, regarded by some as the most famous atheist in the world. He's also Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. Professor Dawkins, good afternoon.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for joining us. Your book is The Magic of Reality. And this is, just to be clear, this came out last year, didn't it, with illustrations, and you've now brought it out without them.
That's right. It was a very lavishly illustrated book, pictures by Dave McKean, very beautiful pictures. This is the paperback edition, which has stripped most of the pictures out, so it's designed to be read probably by a slightly older audience, maybe, and it's also now in a fit state to be a Kindle book. Which was an important gap in the previous, in the picture edition.
And so it's called The Magic of Reality, and the premise, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but it's essentially that the poetic magic of how things actually work, of science, is much more exciting and beautiful and breathtaking than actual magic and the magic of myths and miracles.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that science is sold rather short in schools, where it's tended to be regarded as a rather dry subject, but science is actually magically exciting. It's enthralling, it's spellbinding, and far more spellbinding than, well, either stage magic or than myth.
Gee, what age is it aimed at? I've read the book, and it's essentially a science lesson.
Yes.
And what I see as a 36-year-old man, I'm glad I read. I don't think it's aimed at me, but there's a lot of stuff in here that you vaguely remember from school, but need to read again to know that you've actually got it in your head.
It is aimed at you. It's aimed at all ages. I did have in mind a sort of target age of about 12 at the sort of bottom end, but actually you can go down even further than that. But it is aimed at an adult audience as well, and I suppose in particular the new paperback edition could be regarded as more suitable for an adult audience.
But it's interesting, so it is aimed at kids as well. And this is
Definitely,
the point I wanted to make is that, one of the themes, as one would expect from a Richard Dawkins book, is that the holy books are full of made-up stories that science has disproved, and that you shouldn't believe them, and you should believe science.
There's very little about what we would ordinarily recognise as holy books. Each chapter begins with myths. But they're myths from all around the world, and the Judeo-Christian myth is only lightly touched upon in a few of the chapters. There are myths from Australian Aboriginals, from Incas, from Egyptians, from Greeks. All the myths of the world are put in for their poetic merit, but the poetic merit of science is even better.
Yeah, I mean, we should say they're what you see as myths, I think, shouldn't we, technically? But I suppose for me, even when you were talking about the myths of Tasmanian tribes, I always thought really what you were getting at. Maybe this is because of how you're known and perceived. I always thought even with those myths, what you're really getting at are what you call the myths of the big famous holy texts.
In the sense that the myths of the big famous holy texts are just myths like Australian Aboriginal myths and ancient Egyptian myths and ancient Greek myths and Nordic myths and so on. There is no difference between them. They are all myths. There's no more evidence for the Judeo-Christian myth than there is for the myths of Valhalla or the myths of Olympia.
No, there's a point I was going to make a moment ago, which is so you aim this, it's aimed at kids, and it's often been said that one of the things that religions do, the major religions do, is that they sort of indoctrinate kids, that they get a hold on them when they're very, very young, and that's one of the reasons for their success. I mean, is this an attempt to counteract this? Is this an attempt to indoctrinate young people into the ways of atheism?
No, it's certainly an attempt to counteract that kind of indoctrination, but it is not indoctrination. This is an attempt to show children and young people and all people the evidence for what is true. Evidence is the key thing. Indoctrination is not presenting evidence. Indoctrination is saying, this is what you must believe. This is what our people have always believed. This is what our holy book says. That's indoctrination.
But isn't that what you're doing with the science book?
Not at all. What I'm doing with science is saying, here is the evidence. And evidence is the key word. You're not saying believe this because that's what the holy book of science says. We're saying believe it because here is the evidence.
Is the evidence of science ever actually settled, though?
Well, it changes, it gets more up to date, it's modified. One of the glories of science is that there's plenty more of it to do, but there are some things that we absolutely know are true. I mean, we know that the Earth orbits the Sun, we know that Jupiter orbits the Sun, we know the size of the Sun, we know the size of the planets, we know the age of the Earth. There are all sorts of things that we do know. There are other things that we don't yet know. There are other things which are hypothetical, where good theories have been proposed, good hypotheses have been proposed, which may or may not be falsified in the future. But we shouldn't run away with the idea that everything in science is up for grabs. It isn't. There's an awful lot of science which is known absolutely for sure, and it would be perverse to deny it.
There's some very exciting stuff in here that I didn't know, and I know you're with me till 3, so I will go through some of the stuff in the book that really stood out to me and at times excited me. But for example, on page 17 of your book, you say we know exactly how DNA works. One critic of the book said, "Nature each week reveals new insights, including the many ways in which DNA is in constant dialogue with its surroundings. And as in all life science, how can we claim to understand exactly how it works?"
We don't know exactly how it works.
You do say that, though.
Well, that critic is perfectly correct, that we're learning more and more of the details. But what I meant when I said, I'd forgotten that I'd written that, but what I meant when I said that would certainly have been that we know the fundamentals of it. We know that DNA is a double helix, and we know how it's decoded. We know how the genetic code works. We know how the DNA code is read out in the form of protein. That we know. There are all sorts of details about how DNA works that most certainly we don't know, and it's an exciting process finding out.
Let's go through some of the stuff in the book, and then I want to come back to one or two other topics. You were mentioned by Rowan Williams this week, and I don't know if you saw that in an interview with the Evening Standard when he was discussing how Christianity haunts Britain, and he's fascinated by the fact that you're fascinated by Christianity and always drawn to it. But let's come back to that. Let's just focus on the book. So it's the magic of reality. And the age, what do you hope, for those who read it who are sort of 12 years old or a little bit younger, what is it you really hope to achieve with the magic of reality?
Well, I hope that they will find science exciting, intriguing, enthralling, thrilling, and that they will be moved and inspired, possibly to take up science, but in any case to go through their life with a scientific point of view.
Is science growing as a topic in schools?
Well, I don't think it is, and it should be. It's not just useful. Of course, science is useful, but science is also thrilling and poetic, and it would be tragic if people go through life without having the necessary science education to understand the world, the universe in which they live, and also to understand how to evaluate critically evidence, because we need a lot more critical evaluation of evidence in everyday life, in politics, in the civil service, and so on.
Did you see today the Education Secretary was talking about essentially return to O-levels and making exams a bit more rigorous and tougher, which one assumes would include science? Would you welcome that?
Well, I would like to see science taught in an exciting way, in a thrilling way, not in a dry and dull way, and I think that it could be taught at a much younger age than it is.
At what age do people? What age is it taught at now? When do science lessons begin?
I'm actually not very familiar with that. I mean, for me, science began rather late, and rather too late, I think.
Okay. How would you teach it exciting? What's the answer to that?
Well, I think forget about it being useful all the time. Stop trying to drag it down to the level of what's useful in everyday life. Boggle their minds with the stars, with the universe, with the galaxies, with great distances, with great spans of time, with the great complexity of living things. Astonishing facts like the number of miles of nerve cell, the number of miles of blood vessel that there are in a single human body, for example.
I quoted from your book to the people in the office earlier a couple of lines. The full stop at the end of this sentence contains 1,000,000,000 atoms. That was nice. A dust mite contains 100 trillion atoms.
That's right. That's the kind of thing which I think would really grab young children and would give them something to go home and tell their parents about.
By the way, I mentioned Michael Gove that he's got a plan to give every school pupil a Bible, hasn't he? Which I think you've spoken about.
I supported that.
But not for the same reasons that he supports it.
Well, I don't know what reason he supports it. Politicians pretend to be religious when very often they're not, so I've no idea whether he really is religious. I support it because the Bible is an essential part of our culture, of any English-speaking person's culture, and it's an essential part of our literature, essential part of our history, and so you are illiterate if you do not have some knowledge of the Bible.
So you would always recommend that people read at least some of the Bible?
I think they need some familiarity. I mean, it's purely, it's a gimmick, of course, just giving a Bible to every school. I presume every school's already got a Bible anyway. So that's a gimmick, but it's kind of a symbolic gimmick. It's symbolic of the need not to forget about the Bible as a part of our culture.
Do you find much of the Bible beautiful, or some of it beautiful?
In the King James Version, yes, not in modern translations, which are pathetic.
When was the last time you looked at one or read one?
The Bible?
Yeah.
Oh, a couple of days ago.
Actually, the presenter who hosts the show before me said, I've got a question for Richard Dawkins. It just occurred to me. She said, can you ask him when was the last time he prayed?
Oh, probably when I was about 14.
When you were 14? Was that the point? Was that the age at which you became... Actually, you don't call yourself an atheist, do you? You call yourself an agnostic.
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, you can't actually deny the existence of anything. I mean, I and you, we're both afairists, but we can't prove there are no fairies. We're both, to all intents and purposes, agnostic about fairies. I'm the same way about Zeus and Apollo and Mithras and Yahweh.
This is from, I've read the Gold Edition. You have the scale in there, didn't you? Was it 0 to 7 and you're sort of 6.9?
Yes, 1 to 7, that's right. So 7 would be, you absolutely know there's no God, and nobody can know there's no God, like you can't know there are no fairies. But I call myself 6.9 or something like that.
What was the age when you decided that you were almost certain there was no God?
Oh, probably about 16.
And what happened? What made you...
Well, I think that was finally when I discovered the power of Darwinian natural selection to explain the elegance and beauty of life, and previously I still had a sort of hankering after some kind of design. I'd given up Christianity before that, but I still had a sort of hankering for a less specified God.
Okay, Richard Dawkins is with me. We shall talk more about some of the detail of this book, which is out now in paperback, The Magic of Reality. The Magic of Reality by Professor Richard Dawkins. Let me play you this clip of David Cameron talking about... Thank you very much, Will. It's 2:39. Professor Richard Dawkins is with me. His new book is The Magic of Reality. I say new book, it came out last year with a number of illustrations. It's now out in paperback and can be downloaded as well. Richard, let's just go through some of the sections of the book and one or two of the chapters. Just to explain how it works, many of the chapters open with a myth of some sort, don't they?
Yes, they open with a myth from somewhere around the world, and I try to draw the myths from all over the world, and some of them are very colourful and very nice to read. And then the rest of the chapter is the scientific answer, the true answer to the question posed by the chapter heading.
It's a chapter about evolution, and I enjoyed the thought experiment in there, where you ask people do you want to explain it, where you get a photo of yourself and keep adding to it?
Yes, this is one of many attempts to convey the sheer magnitude of geological time. And I asked people to get a photograph of themselves, put on top of it a photograph of their father or their mother, a photograph of the grandfather or grandmother, and so on. Go on piling up these photographs for generation after generation until you get a pile of photographs that's sort of the height of 40 New York skyscrapers or something of that sort, by which time you get back to your 200 millionth great-great-great-great-grandfather, and he turns out to be a fish. So you are descended from a fish, and yet there's a sort of paradox. It's not a very big paradox. There's a kind of paradox that if you look generation by generation, every generation is of the same species as the previous one and the next one. So if you were to walk through this line of photographs, this stack of photographs, picking them off one by one, every one would look like and would indeed be the same species as the next one. But if you go through enough of them, the change being so incredibly gradual, you eventually get back to a fish. And then, of course, before that, to something even older.
No. I mean, ultimately, we share an ancestor with everything, with vegetation, don't we?
We do. We share an ancestor with every living creature that's ever had its DNA looked at.
And you also use the example of having a baby or a toddler, that day by day, your baby looks identical.
That's right. I mean, we are not the same as we were when we were a baby, and yet every day we don't suddenly wake up and say, oh, I don't seem to be a child anymore, I seem to be an adult. Or we don't wake up and say, I don't seem to be middle-aged anymore, I've woken up old. It doesn't happen like that. It happens gradually. And you only need that analogy in order to understand why it is, this paradox, that you're descended from a fish, and yet every intermediate is the same species as its neighbours in the line.
Are we still evolving?
Nobody knows that, but we probably are. There's no reason to think that we're not. But the problem is that the pace at which evolution takes place is so slow compared with the pace of human life that we're used to, that it's hard to make any kind of prediction. You don't see evolution going on before your very eyes, or not much anyway, not in humans.
You talk about the iguanas on the Galapagos Islands. They're famously where Charles Darwin went on HMS Beagle, where some people believe that the theory of evolution first occurred to him evidentially anyway, occurred to him at the Galapagos Islands. But you explain how you get different species of iguanas and how they've evolved. And you talk about in 1990, something happened in 95.
I think you're referring to an event in the West Indies where some iguanas were blown ashore by a hurricane on vegetation, floating vegetation, and colonized an island where they hadn't been any before. And this is classically what happens when a new species forms. Islands, such as the Galapagos archipelago, are sort of workshops of evolutionary divergence, because without islands, without separation, and islands, by the way, could be water surrounded by land. It doesn't have to be land surrounded by water. The separation that's provided by islands means that the populations on these islands can drift apart in evolution until they reach the point where, if they ever meet again, they can no longer reproduce. And then, by definition, they're different species. And so what happened on Galapagos is, because it's an archipelago which is quite a long way, about 600 miles away from the mainland, but only a few tens of miles each island from the next island, it's very rare to have animals drifting from the mainland of South America to the Galapagos archipelago. Once they're there, however, they can start evolving in a different way, and then they drift from island to island much more often, which means that there's plenty of opportunity for evolutionary divergence from island to island, and then they meet each other and can no longer reproduce.
But evolutionary diversity works when, I think you say this, so it's a barrier that can only be crossed very occasionally.
Yes, if it can never be crossed, then of course it can't never get started. But the idea is, if it can be crossed just occasionally, then there's time for evolutionary change to happen on each island in between the driftings across to the next island. If the islands are so close that they're drifting across all the time, then evolutionary divergence can't happen, because the change is constantly being swamped by sexual mixing.
There are, of course, plenty of people who don't believe in evolution and sincerely don't believe in it, or they believe in either a creator or an intelligent design. And it's often said that they often cite a sort of a gap in the evolutionary chain. What do you say to those arguments?
Well, they just don't know what they're talking about. I mean, when you say plenty of people don't believe in evolution, no well-educated people don't believe in evolution. And those who talk about gaps usually have just read a book prior Jehovah's Witness or something saying there are gaps. There are, of course there are gaps. I mean, you would expect there to be gaps, because fossilization is a very rare process. Nevertheless, there are enormous numbers of intermediates in the evolutionary story.
The point is interesting when you talk about how no well-educated people believe in evolution. That's what you say. There are certainly very well-educated and very bright people who believe in God, who believe in
Of course there are, but we're not talking about God. We're talking about creationism. We're talking about people who don't believe evolution has happened. A proper Christian, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course he believes in evolution. Any bishop does.
No, but I suppose I'm making the point that actually the people who have, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Barack Obama, whoever you want to choose, who cites themselves as religion, they are well educated, but to be a Christian, they have to believe in a virgin birth, and they have to believe in the resurrection, which is told with scientific evidence.
Well, you've changed the subject now. I mean, we were talking about evolution, and what I said was that no well-educated person doesn't believe in evolution. Plenty of well-educated people believe in the virgin birth and the resurrection. That's a different matter.
The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about you this week. He's obviously leaving his post, and he was interviewed in the Evening Standard. And he talks about Christianity haunting Great Britain, and he was saying it's something that we can't live with it and we can't live without it. And he's intrigued, he says, by the fact that you in particular keep coming back. He's intrigued by the fact that you are so drawn to Christianity.
I'm not sure I'm drawn to Christianity. I'm drawn to the truth about origins. I'm fascinated by the truth about where we come from, where life comes from. That's my subject. That's what I'm paid to do. And so naturally I'm interested in the religious alternative to that view. But I wouldn't say I'm particularly drawn to Christianity, except insofar as I was brought up and confirmed into the Church of England. And so that's the brand of religion that I'm most familiar with. But I wouldn't say I'm exactly drawn to it. I'm drawn to ideas about origins and why the world is the way that it is. And religions do constitute an alternative version of that truth.
I suppose what I was getting at in my earlier question was, are you intrigued by the way that very, very well-educated people make accommodation for miracles?
Yes, that does intrigue me, having established that this is a quite different point from whether they believe in evolution. I don't want to be tarred with the brush of saying that all Christians are idiots. I'm saying that all young earth creationists are either ignorant or idiots. But that does not apply to bishops and people like that. We're not talking about that. Now, you raise the question of miracles. I think it is very difficult for a scientist to believe in miracles such as the virgin birth, such as turning water into wine, walking on water. It's so easy and so plausible to think of how stories like that get invented. And we pretty much know that the virgin birth story was invented by a textual error, by a mistranslation from Hebrew into the Greek of the Septuagint, where the Hebrew word for young woman was mistranslated into the Greek word for virgin, and that's where it all stems from. So there are very plausible reasons why miracle stories get invented. They get passed on. I have a chapter in The Magic of Reality.
It's the final chapter.
Yes, I mean, about the way miracle stories do get passed on, rumours get passed on. We are an astonishingly rumour-hungry species. We love passing on tall stories. And the stories of turning water into wine, of the virgin birth, of the resurrection, these are classic tall stories, just like the urban myths that whiz around the internet today.
Do you ever worry about, I mean, you said a moment ago that you're certainly not saying that people who believe in miracles are stupid, but do you ever worry about the fact that you make up, about implying, about how you come across? Do you ever worry that you, with some of your comments and occasionally with your tone that I've seen in interviews, that you perhaps imply that people with sincerely held religious views are a bit simple or a bit stupid?
Well, I do want to make this distinction between young earth creationists who believe that the world is only 6,000 years old. Let's sort of separate them off. I mean, anybody who thinks the world is 6,000 years old is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. Now, that sounds like a very radical, a very arrogant thing to say, but it's the simple truth. It's not a criminal offence to be ignorant. I'm ignorant of all sorts of things. I mean, I'm ignorant of baseball, and it's no crime to be ignorant of something. But so when I say that people who believe in young earth creationism are ignorant, stupid, or insane, that is just a simple statement that any scientist would actually have to agree with, even if he upbraided me for the radical language that I use. When you actually put it to him, what else could they be other than ignorant, stupid, or insane? He'd be unable to come up with an answer.
Okay. Well, have you ever looked back on an interview that you've given, a debate you've taken part in, and thought you perhaps come across as just too strident?
Oh, probably, yes. I mean, and the word strident, by the way, has become such a cliche. It's one that's applied to me absolutely all the time. Mostly I'm not.
But often the cliches are there because they have an element of truth about
them. Well, there may be occasional element of truth, but mostly it's just that a word like that gets tied to one.
And does it bother you? Do you think it's accurate?
Of course it's not accurate, no. I mean, it does bother me when people believe what they hear about somebody without actually going and checking up for themselves.
Okay. We shall take some travel and talk some more about this book. It's The Magic of Reality by Richard Dawkins. It's 2:52. Richard Dawkins is with me, Professor Richard Dawkins. The book is The Magic of Reality, which is, for those that didn't hear the start of the interview, Richard, it is a book in which you explain that, in your view, the poetic reality of how life actually works is much more exciting and more magic than anything that's explained via myths and miracles.
Yes, and I would like to stress, this is a science book. I mean, You've chosen to concentrate on religion in this interview for some reason, but actually there's almost nothing about religion in the book. It is a science book, and it covers all sorts of different aspects of science, not just biology, but physics and chemistry as well.
It's a very good science book, and as I said to you earlier, I think reading it as a 36-year-old man, there's stuff in here that you relearn from school that you sort of vaguely remember. And
I'm very glad to hear that. That's very good.
And no, look, I was just but then again, a lot of chapters open with myth, and you explain myths and
yes, but not Christian myths. I mean, these are myths from all around the world.
Yes, I know they are. Yeah. I know they are. Although in the last chapter you talk about the water into wine myth. Explain who David Hume is. He's someone you talk about in the final chapter.
Oh, well, David Hume is a great Scottish philosopher of the Enlightenment, and I mentioned him because of his view on miracles, which is a very interesting view. He says that you should never accept the evidence for a miracle unless it would be even more of a miracle that the person who told you about it was lying or was mistaken than the miracle itself. So if you take something like water into wine, which you've just mentioned, it could have happened. It would be a gigantic miracle. It would violate all sorts of laws of chemistry and physics, but it could have happened. On the other hand, the alternative is that somebody made it up. Now, which would be the greater miracle, that somebody made it up or that it really happened? Once it's a sort of no-brainer once you put it that way.
I understand you're working on your memoirs. Are they going to be your next book?
Well, I've only just started that, but I have been persuaded by publishers to write a scientific autobiography about...
How does that work?
Well, I mean, just about my history as a scientist, how I developed. I'm so far been writing chapters about my childhood and school days, and then I shall be moving on to my career as a scientist, the books that I've written, and so on.
Are you enjoying that process, the sort of writing about yourself process?
Well, I'm enjoying the school days part. It's going to be harder, I think, when I get on to the adult part, but so far I'm quite enjoying it, yes. I've been talking to my mother a lot about it, who's got an excellent memory for what happened long ago, and so I've been, as it were, pumping her for information about my own childhood, which has been a very nice experience for me.
Is she religious?
No.
Have you ever tried to measure the impact that your books have had on people? Is it possible to do that?
I haven't done it systematically, and I would like to see a systematic measure of it. I do get a great number of letters from people who've read my books, and I get a great number of people coming up to me in book signing queues when I've just given a lecture, that kind of thing. So I get a lot of feedback from individual people, but I've never systematically done a survey, no.
Do you think, I was thinking of the quotes that Baroness Wolsey spoke about this year, the Tory party chairman, she was talking about militant secularism in Britain, and a philosopher I know said to me the other day that he thinks Britain might now be the most secular country in the world. Now, I don't know if that's actually true or how you could measure that. If it were to be true, do you think you have played a part, or even perhaps a significant part in that?
Well, I'd be surprised if Britain was. I mean, I think the Scandinavian countries probably would have that honour, but I would like to think that Britain was well on the way to that, yes. And I would also like to think that the books that people like me and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dan Dennett and Victor Stenger and others have written might have had some influence, yes.
Let's have a look at some text. I'm a Quaker and appreciate both science and mystery. I always experienced Richard Dawkins as another kind of fundamentalist who uses divisive language and actions, but today he seems to have toned things down. Does Richard Dawkins agree with me?
No. That person is listening to me the way I really am, and I strongly suspect that he hasn't actually read any of my books.
Yeah. I mean, there has been. I mean, I notice almost within the atheist community, if one can describe there as being an atheist community, that you hear some people say things like, "Well, I'm an atheist," but I do think that Richard Dawkins goes a little bit too far.
You hear that over and over and over again, and it's people who've heard other people saying the same thing. And what I would love them to do is actually go and read what I've written myself. That's all I ask.
Does it bother you when you get that sort of...
It bothers me when people condemn me for something that I haven't said, and when all they are doing is repeating what somebody else has said about what I've said.
Here's another text. This is from Mark. It says, theories must be changed and adapted as more information comes along. Irreducible complexity in intelligent design is something acknowledged by many eminent scientists across the world as clearly evident. If such evidences of design and intelligence cannot be ignored, will Mr. Dawkins follow scientific procedure and change his view? Is he completely close to any other view but evolution?
Irreducible complexity is an old idea that Darwin disposed of himself in 1859. There's nothing new about it. Many of my books, at least 3 of my books, have been dealing with almost nothing but so-called irreducible complexity, and I deal with every case that's ever been suggested. It is not a good argument at all. There is no good evidence against evolution. There's plenty of excellent evidence in favour of evolution.
Mark in Cheltenham says, isn't being an atheist too easy these days? It demands no faith.
Well, it doesn't demand faith. What it does is demand looking at evidence dispassionately, evaluating evidence and coming to the right conclusion. Faith is believing things without evidence, and that's supremely lazy.
Do you ever worry about the reaction that a book of yours will generate?
Well, I like my books to be favourably received, and they very often are. Not by everybody. I'm not sure worry would be quite the right word to use. I would worry if my book was wantonly misunderstood, but I don't lie awake worrying. I wonder how this book's going to be received.
Yeah. So the magic of reality is out now in paperback. You're working on your memoirs. What else, Richard? What else would you like to achieve in your career?
Well, I would like to bring as many people as possible to appreciate the wonder of science and how beautiful it is to understand the universe and life.
When you look at America, you sometimes get the sense that, if anything, there's an increasing rejection of science. Why do you think that's happened?
Well, I think America's sort of splitting into two, really. I mean, the sort of Americans that I meet, which are mostly people in universities, are among the leaders in science in the world. Of course they are. The sort of people who vote for George Bush and Sarah Palin, I've hardly ever met any of them. They apparently exist. And there is a widespread misunderstanding and indeed suspicion of science. It shows itself not only in evolution but in climate change denial and a general suspicion of science, and indeed of intellectualism generally, a suspicion of the intellect and of education.
Richard Dawkins, thank you.
Sold rather short in schools, where it's tended to be regarded as a rather dry subject, but science is actually magically exciting. It's enthralling, it's spellbinding, and far more spellbinding than, well, either stage magic or than myth.
Gee, what age is it aimed at? I've read the book, and it's essentially a science lesson.
Yes.
And what I see as a 36-year-old man, I'm glad I read. I don't think it's aimed at me, but there's a lot of stuff in here that you vaguely remember from school, but need to read again to know that you've actually got it in your head.
It is aimed at you. It's aimed at all ages. I did have in mind a sort of target age of about 12 at the sort of bottom end, but actually you can go down even further than that. But it is aimed at an adult audience as well, and I suppose in particular the new paperback edition could be regarded as more suitable for an adult audience.
But it's interesting. So it is aimed at kids as well. And this is
Definitely,
the
yes.
point I wanted to make is that, one of the themes, as one would expect from a Richard Dawkins book, is that the holy books are full of made-up stories that science...
Modified. One of the glories of science is that there's plenty more of it to do, but there are some things that we absolutely know are true. I mean, we know that the Earth orbits the Sun, we know that Jupiter orbits the Sun, we know the size of the Sun, we know the size of the planets, we know the age of the Earth. There are all sorts of things that we do know. There are other things that we don't yet know. There are other things which are hypothetical, where good theories have been proposed, good hypotheses have been proposed, which may or may not be falsified in the future. But we shouldn't run away with the idea that everything in science is up for grabs. It isn't. There's an awful lot of science which is known absolutely for sure, and it would be perverse to deny it.
There's some very exciting stuff in here that I didn't know, and I know you're with me till 3, so I will go through some of the stuff in the book that really stood out to me and at times excited me. But for example, on page 17 of your book, you say we know exactly how DNA works. One critic of the book said, "Nature each week reveals new insights, including the many ways in which DNA is in constant dialogue with its surroundings. And as in all life science, how can we claim to understand exactly..." Gary Barlow too. It's 20 minutes past 2. Let's talk to Professor Richard Dawkins, regarded by some as the most famous atheist in the world. He's also Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. Professor Dawkins, good afternoon.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for joining us. Your book is The Magic of Reality. And this is, just to be clear, this came out last year, didn't it, with illustrations, and you've now brought it out without them.
That's right. It was a very lavishly illustrated book. Pictures by Dave McKean, very beautiful pictures. This is the paperback edition, which has stripped most of the pictures out. So it's designed to be read probably by a slightly older audience, maybe. And it's also now in a fit state to be a Kindle book. Which was an important gap in the previous, in the picture edition.
And so it's called The Magic of Reality, and the premise, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but it's essentially that the poetic magic of how things actually work, of science, is much more exciting and beautiful and breathtaking than actual magic and the magic of myths and miracles.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that science
has disproved, and that you shouldn't believe them, and you should believe science.
There's very little about what we would ordinarily recognise as holy books. Each chapter begins with myths. But they're myths from all around the world, and the Judeo-Christian myth is only lightly touched upon in a few of the chapters. There are myths from Australian Aboriginals, from Incas, from Egyptians, from Greeks, all the myths of the world are put in for their poetic merit, but the poetic merit of science is even better.
Yeah, I mean, we should say they're what you see as myths, I think, shouldn't we, technically? But I suppose for me, even when you were talking about the myths of Tasmanian tribes, I always thought really what you were getting at. Maybe this is because of how you're known and perceived. I always thought even with those myths, what you're really getting at are what you call the myths of the big famous holy texts.
In the sense that the myths of the big famous holy texts are just myths like Australian Aboriginal myths and ancient Egyptian myths and ancient Greek myths and Nordic myths and so on. There is no difference between them. They are all myths. There's no more evidence for the Judeo-Christian myth than there is for the myths of Valhalla or the myths of Olympia.
No, this is the point I was going to make a moment ago, which is so you own this, it's aimed at kids, and it's often been said that one of the things that religions do, the major religions do, is that they sort of indoctrinate kids, that they get a hold on them when they're very, very young, and that's one of the reasons for their success. I mean, is this an attempt to counteract this? Is this an attempt to indoctrinate young people into the ways of atheism?
No, it's certainly an attempt to counteract that kind of indoctrination, but it is not indoctrination. This is an attempt to show children and young people and all people the evidence for what is true. Evidence is the key thing. Indoctrination is not presenting evidence. Indoctrination is saying, this is what you must believe. This is what our people have always believed. This is what our holy book says. That's indoctrination. But isn't that what you're doing with the science book? Not at all. What I'm doing with science is saying, here is the evidence. And evidence is the key word. You're not saying believe this because that's what the holy book of science says. We're saying believe it because here is the evidence.
Is the evidence of science ever actually settled, though?
Well, it changes. It gets more up to date. It